Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Angelica Haggart, and I am the interim digital editor here at Canadian Geographic. And I'm here at 50 Sussex Drive, and the RCGS, the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, would like to acknowledge that our offices are located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples, whom have been the guardians of and in relationship with these lands for thousands of years. We further acknowledge and recognize that our work reaches across all of the distinct First Nations, the Métis homeland, and Inuit, Nunangat, and for this, we are grateful. Tonight, I'm delighted to be joined by John Stackhouse, who is a nationally best-selling author and a leading voice on innovation and economic disruption. Since 2014, John has served as Senior Vice President in the Office of the CEO at Royal Bank of Canada. Previously, he was the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail. John believes that one of the country's most valuable resources are the 3 million Canadians who don't live here, and he explores that in his recent book called Planet Canada, which I'm sure we'll hear more about this evening. As John speaks, if you have questions, please drop them in the comments section of wherever you're joining us from tonight. And with that, John, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Great. Well, thank you, Angelica, for that really kind introduction, and to everyone at Canadian Geographic for facilitating and hosting this conversation. I'll talk for maybe 10 minutes or so about my new book called Planet Canada, and then love to turn it open to a wide-ranging conversation. As I was getting ready for tonight, I thought this is either the perfect group and community to talk about Planet Canada with, or the most ironic group you could assemble. Because as you'll read in the book, my core thesis is that we as Canadians need to, in many ways, start to transcend geography. We have to think beyond borders and think, and this was all written before COVID really accelerated this. But we really need to think of the world in this kind of digital age, which has overtaken us all, overwhelmed us in many ways over the last 6 months. I think this is an incredible moment for Canada if we seize on it and take advantage of that population that we call the 11th province of this country. So maybe it is a little bit of geography there if we're adding an 11th province. There's some debate about whether borders have become more significant in this crisis, or whether this is just a passing moment and we will move to an even more borderless world. There's a lot of talk about the cloud that we all live in. This conversation is no doubt hosted in a cloud, but so much of our lives, our culture, and our politics are transcending borders, not just through technology, but through the way the world is going, that I hope we can talk about this evening. Because I think this is a moment for Canadians to challenge ourselves, not to withdraw from the world, but also not to try to work our way back to a world of our imagination or a world of our nostalgia. The world has changed profoundly, and this crisis has accelerated and in some ways compressed that change. Canada has to hurry up and change with the world. We have an opportunity to do that with our expats, the group I call Planet Canada. If we're going to do that, we need to recognize a few blunt realities about the world. Number one, we are shrinking. We are becoming less relevant on pretty much every score there is in terms of share of population, share of global GDP, share of defense, share of development spending, our share of global science are all in decline. That's almost a mathematical probability given the rise of the rest of the world. And it's okay. This is not a fault of Canada's. It is really just a reflection of how the rest of the world is changing, and we need to change. We need to change with it. I hope this came home for a lot of Canadians in the United Nations Security Council vote, because there was a lot of finger pointing around that and many reasons for the outcome. But I thought it reflected that change in the world and the change in Canada's place in the world. And it was an opportunity for Canada to maybe finally come to grips with some changes and to start to pivot and see ourselves a bit more as a small power rather than a middle power. And I think there's tremendous advantages in being the small power, the Davids of the world, even when we live next door to a Goliath. The small powers, and I profile some in the book, the Israels and Singapores, but also the Irelands and Swedens of the world, and Australia and New Zealand increasingly, are acting like small powers, relying on their brain power, on their people, including their expatriate population, to influence the world, to be more relevant in the world, and to take themselves, their country, and their fellow citizens into the world, even if that's just digitally, as we're doing tonight. So that's kind of small power thinking is a really important part of Planet Canada. So why should we care about these Canadians who have left us? I get asked that a lot. I first started to pay attention to this group, really first came across them in the 1990s when I kind of joined their ranks. I lived overseas in New Delhi, India for most of the 1990s as a Globe and Mail correspondent, and got to travel across Asia and Africa. And pretty much everywhere I went, from Jaffna in Sri Lanka to Kinshasa in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, I'd bump into Canadians, Canadians you'd never heard of, doing the most interesting things, often incredible things. And I kind of put that away in the back of my mind, thinking that's kind of interesting, not really something I appreciated about my country. And then when I moved back to Canada and settled down in the 2000s, I started to notice a bit of a resentment among Canadians towards this expatriate population. This exploded in 2005 with the Lebanese boat lift, if many of you may recall, when because of the civil war, we evacuated 15,000 essentially dual nationals, Lebanese Canadians, at great cost to Canadian taxpayers. And that increased the resentment. But there was also a bit of an inwardness because of 9/11, the rise of ISIS, a sense of people running around the world with the golden passport, the blue passport of Canada, and abusing that privilege, and especially abusing citizenship. And that reaction was not unfair, but I think we started to chip away at the rights and privileges and the connections with this international population at our own cost. In the long term, and we were not thinking strategically the way an Israel or Singapore would about its global population, and that got me going on this project in the mid 2010s. Around 2015, I started a research project with the Monk School, where I'm a senior fellow, in addition to my work here at RBC, and we started to look at we mapped the global population, determining it's 2 to 3 million people. We were able to access social media databases, censuses from various countries, as well as surveys, and articulate the size and location of this population. We also looked at the history of this. This is nothing new. Canadians have been going out into the world since the early 1800s to every corner of the world, often doing incredible things. Really, at on the front lines of history, there was usually a Canadian who didn't make headlines but managed to get things done. We were there literally at the birth of Hollywood and the rise of Broadway. We were there in the early development of the U.S. nuclear program and helped build it through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Quietly, Canadians in the background, and we've had waves and waves of Canadians going out into the world, but being forgotten by us who stayed back in Canada. And we lost that strategic opportunity to have connections with them. And here we are in 2020, and you may think, well, that's all very interesting, and there are lots of great stories there, but why does this really matter to Canada? And it's an essential question, which I try to address in the book with a simple answer. It matters fundamentally because we have moved from a world of institutions to a world of networks. And this is in large part a digital phenomenon, but not only a digital phenomenon. Human networks are among the most powerful forces in the world today. When you think about 2020 and what's determining history this year, of course, Donald Trump is shaping history, and Xi Jinping in China is determining history. But so too are incredible human networks. Black Lives Matter, more powerful than many governments around the world, more powerful than multinational corporations, is a human network. Greta Thunberg and the networks she has built and connects with, more powerful again than many nation states. We could go on and on with these human networks that are shaping largely constructively the destiny and direction of history. So how do we put Canada into those networks? Well, a key way of doing it is to use Canadians who are out there and already driving those networks. Everywhere I went, when I called or clicked on with people or physically went to places, it was very easy to find Canadians in the thick of things, whether it was in business, in arts and entertainment, in sports, in culture, in philanthropy or humanitarian affairs, or media, or academia. There's always a Canadian or group of Canadians as a key node in the network. And that's a key message of the book. How do we as a country connect with those nodes and really 10x our influence in the world? I also get asked, isn't that theory being turned upside down by COVID and also by the rise of nationalism? That may have been true, people say, John, in the 2010s, but surely we've shut the door on that part of history. And it's a fair point. And I argue in the book and subsequently in conversations like this, that coming out of COVID, the world is going to open up again in different ways. It'll be a bit more elbows up. But the need for Canada and Canadians out there is going to be greater than ever. And I'll share with you a few examples before we get to a conversation about this from people I met along the way who illustrate this and argue this about what Canadians essentially bring to the world. First message came from Dominic Barton, a great Canadian, ran McKinsey, the consulting firm, for years and is now our ambassador to China. And I spoke to him a few times for the book. And long before he became ambassador, he said to me, everywhere I go in the world, and he was constantly traveling the world, he said I would go into a meeting, it could be in Asia, it could be in Australia, it could be in Europe. And I always knew who the Canadian was in the room because they were the person who asked questions and listened to the answers. And then he quickly corrected himself and said, actually, the Dutch are like that too. So I had to listen for the accent and know that they were either from the Netherlands or Canada. That's a power skill for the 2020s in which the world will need. And it comes down to the idea of mutual accommodation. It's one of our core strengths as a country. We're not perfect at it. We have to get better at it. But we are better at mutual accommodation than pretty much any other country in the world. We accommodate difference. We accept difference. We're actually interested in difference. We don't try to assimilate. And when our expats go abroad, they take that with them. They are the people who want to accommodate difference. They don't walk into a room or a village or a city and say, you should be like me. They talk about difference and try to bridge it. That may sound like kind of a mushy, nice thing, but it's actually one of our superpowers if we harness it properly for a more divided world, because there will actually be more difference to be bridged and therefore a greater need for Canadians out there in those networks. A couple of examples of that. There's a Canadian in Nashville named Eddie Schwartz. Some of you of a certain age may remember the Pat Benatar song, Hit Me With Your Best Shot. Eddie wrote that song in the 1980s. He's written hundreds of songs. He moved from Toronto to Nashville in the 1990s as part of a great exodus of songwriters, which I explore in the book because the ecosystem here started to dry up because of a lot of things that were going on actually at the CBC, but also in the music industry. And Canadians suddenly populated Nashville, and now you find them everywhere on Music Row in Nashville. And Eddie's made a good living for himself there, but actually rose to the top of the Songwriters Association and now runs it. And last year had to shuttle between the US and Europe, Nashville and Brussels, negotiating an international agreement on digital rights for songwriters. And he got the deal done because, as he explained to me, he thought like a Canadian. He was able to listen to the Europeans and listen to the Americans and not say, hey, you're wrong, they're right, or you're wrong and they're right. He built bridges. He created a middle ground and was able to accommodate both those groups who have very different approaches to digital rights. So a Canadian secret power that the world is going to need more of. We're bridge builders. There's a banker I profile in London in the book who was the number 2 at Deutsche Bank for a number of years. And he said he was the only person who the Germans, the French, the Brits, the Americans, and the Japanese could talk to. So he often had different phones ringing at the same time, but it was the Canadian who was able to connect all those different camps within Deutsche Bank. We have empathy, very different from sympathy. We have empathy, which is the ability to sit in another person's seat or stand in another person's shoes and see a situation from their perspective. Moya Greene took this to Britain when she took over the Royal Mail, the first foreigner and the first female to run the Royal Mail since Henry VIII created it. Talk about a burden of history. And she had to prepare it for privatization. If you know the union culture of England, you know how tough a job that was. If you know the political culture of Britain, you know how tough a job additionally that was. Moya was able to bridge differences by listening to her union leaders, to her political masters, to her customers, and to create bridges between them to get the Royal Mail to where it needed to be. We're very good at going into other cultures. I learned this from a young woman, Lindsay Miller, who is a significant design leader in Dubai, where she's created a whole career for herself by being the Canadian who is able to work in an Arab culture, but also help bring the world to Dubai. They needed a Canadian to do that. And we're seeing this move to a whole different level. This started in the 2010s and it's going to accelerate in the 2020s, not just because of the changes in the world, but the changes here in Canada. We have become the nation that looks more like the world than any other nation, because for a quarter century or more, we have had open doors to the world selectively through immigration. That is now starting to play out real time in our emigration. All those immigrants who came here in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, their children who grew up in Canada are now going out in the world. They started to go out in the 2010s in bigger and bigger numbers. And just the very power of demographics, once the world opens up again, that we're seeing a curve of the so-called hyphenated Canadians who are now coming into their 20s in huge numbers, who are very happy and comfortable going out into the world. They are the cross-cultural generation. It's just natural for them here in Canada, and natural for them when they go to Somalia or Hong Kong or Sydney, Australia. And they are fitting into the world of the 2020s in a way that many others are struggling with. And the world will need more and more of those hyphenated Canadians that are really quite exceptional and will grow in numbers. All of this, I think, is really positive for us as a country and really essential for us, because as a people, as I said at the beginning, we're shrinking in our relative size to the world. If we are going to maintain our relevance in the world, to stand up for our interests, which is important to us as a country, but if we're also going to influence the world in ways that we think are good for the world as well as Canada, it can be in human rights, it can be in climate change, it can be in international trade agreements. We can't do that anymore just as a nation state. We can't do it as the government of Canada showing up and pounding the table and saying, hey, we're Canada, listen to us. Sure, we need some of that. But we also need this secret population that's not so secret of 2 or 3 million Canadians out there, extraordinary people, also pounding the table, saying there's a way of doing this that you may want to think about. We're not going to tell you how to do things. That's not the Canadian way. But you may want to listen to us and work with us. And by the way, and here's one of Canada's value propositions for the 2020s, we can help you solve your problems. And that's the best way to have influence in the world, is showing up, not to demand something, not to ask for something, but to say, you know what, within reason, we can help solve your problems because we're Canadian and we go about things a certain way. Love to throw it open to a conversation about how we can do that, but maybe I can just end off or leave you with a little quote from the book. I'll read 2 lines from it. It's from page 292. It says, our diaspora, creative, driven, connected, can help position Canada for the rest of the 21st century. It can be a megaphone for our small voice, a connector for our small numbers, and a lever for our big ambitions. Thanks for sharing in the conversation, and I hope we can all do our part to make Planet Canada a reality for the 2020s.
Thank you so much, John. That your insights are just so valuable, and I have been frantically scribbling down notes as you talked. I also have a little couple lines here highlighted. Mine's from page 23, although there's a couple of cookies in here, so it's not my only highlighted lines. It says, Canadians are not inherently virtuous, nor does every Canadian take on the world solely in the pursuit of good. And that connects me to a question that we actually received from one of our Canadian Geographic education team members. Her name is Dominique. And she wants to know, how do we encourage exporting Canadian values into other parts of the world while still remaining sensitive and respectful of other cultures without acting like maybe just that we know best?
It's such a great question. And in some ways, one of our great strengths is our greatest weakness. We don't like to boast. That's fine, but in some ways we got to get over that, because there's a real value to this. And in some ways we can say to the world, we're like you, because we have brought the world to Canada. And yeah, the climate's pretty different from a lot of the world, but we function much like much of the world. Of course, we have a different political system, different economic system, but we accommodate. And that is a message that I've not found a resistance to in almost any part of the world. You can go into authoritarian states, you can go into culturally extremely different places. When you talk about accommodation, most people are interested in that. In the most remote village in Afghanistan, I have found the village leaders can have a meaningful conversation about mutual accommodation, because in that village, there's actually difference. We may not see it, but they sure see it. And the village leaders are trying to figure out how to do it. So I think we can offer that. But we do have to start to lean forward more as a country. We have to be more like the British are with the British Council, or the French are, not in a colonial way, the way they are, but being a little more upfront. This costs us money, and I'd encourage our government to invest more in this space, to say, look, here's Canada, and it's not one day a year at a party, it's 365 days a year on offer, and we can do it digitally. It doesn't have to just be in a nice location. In fact, for the foreseeable future, it's going to have to be digitally.
So on that note, digitally as well, one of the things that I scribbled down madly over here was, obviously, when you started writing Planet Canada, you probably did not expect there to be a global pandemic in place. Would you have changed anything about the way that you wrote the book, knowing now what we know about the importance of geography and digital geography as well?
Yeah, what a great question. I think I would have accented a couple of the points, underscored a couple of the points that I mentioned, which have become more acute in this crisis. The need for Canadians to be out there building bridges. I started this book actually before Donald Trump was elected and before Brexit, and those gave me pause. And I thought, there goes my book. It doesn't stand up anymore. And after a bit of a pause, I realized, no, wait a second. That's exactly why this is needed. Because of the rise of nationalism, there's a need, maybe not for more Canada, but for more Canadians out there, because the populace are not terribly resistant to Canadians. So our value to the world is greater. There's been a bit of an increase in the pandemic to get more Canadians and other people to move here, and I've got nothing against that, but I think we also need to be mindful of getting more Canadians out into the world. We need both. We need a revolving door, which can sound like a pejorative, but it's actually a very good way of getting people in and out of a building. So we need more revolving doors at our borders, metaphorically, to get Canadians out into the world while we bring more people into the world. COVID clearly has been a bit of a door jam for the time being, but this is temporary. We'll overcome the virus. People will want to get out into the world a bit more, and we can't be hesitant because other countries were really gaining an advantage on us. As I show in the book, countries like Singapore and India and Australia doing incredible things with their global populations. This kind of pause moment is a chance for us to catch up, or at least plan to catch up. So we need to take this, and this is the last thing I'll say of what I would probably reflect on more if I could do the book with COVID in hindsight, is to use this pause moment to really get a strategy going on our global population.
Aaron Kiley, our editor-in-chief and associate publisher, he wants to know, beyond the US, which of course is right next door, but is there a certain country or a number of countries where there are a greater number of expat Canadians? And what do you think is attracting people to that country?
So you find Canadians in big numbers in key global centers: New York, Los Angeles, London. Silicon Valley is fascinating. There's a huge number of Canadians there. I devote a couple of chapters to it because of the excellent tech schools here in Canada. And that for a time was a brain drain. And I devote a chapter to the brain drain debate. But it's become much more of a brain circulation. And there's a group called the C100 that's been really catalytic in that, and we need to find ways to turn the C100 into the C1 million to help a million Canadian expats out there help us. People go there because they're global centers. They attract people from all over the world. They go there often for universities, for post-grad studies, or to teach there. They go there because of cultural familiarity, US, UK, France, especially. Recently, and by recently I mean over the last 20 years, there's been a really interesting rise in Canadians in other centers. Hong Kong, for reasons that are probably well known to this group, and it's going to be an interesting challenge for Canada over the next while. Something like 300,000 dual Canadians there, but rising numbers in Lebanon, in Dubai, in parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia. As Canadians, this dual migration, Canadians who have come here are going out to their ancestral countries and taking Canada with them. A lot of Canadians in Somalia and in the Somali parliament as a bit of an extreme example, but just as an indication of that two-way flow that we need to think about harnessing for our advantage.
Marina Jimenez, sorry if I pronounced your last name wrong, Marina, thank you for watching. She wants to know, what country does, in your opinion, the best job in leveraging their diaspora's influence, and how do they do it so well?
Hey, Marina, we used to work together, so it's great to at least hear your name and know we're connected virtually. Of course, you would ask such an outstanding question. What country is doing this well? Well, Israel and Singapore, I've mentioned, are as small powers. They have both, and Taiwan, I would add to that list. They both, for a time, thought, how do we get people to come back? And they have return programs. But they realized that once people leave their home country and stay away for more than 5 years, the odds of them coming back are pretty low. Lots of academic studies over the decades show this, regardless of source country and destination country. So Israel and Singapore have said, okay, we can't fight that force. It's not about us. That's just human nature. So how do we take advantage of them where they are? So they kind of flipped the story and said, rather than come back, they found a way to kind of knock on the door and say, respecting privacy, and this is something Canadians have to get over, saying, we happen to know you're here, or we've heard you're here. Can you help us? And how can we help you? Because if you're successful, we'll be successful. And they're really aggressive in a positive way about that. India has also kind of flipped the narrative over the last 20 years and has become very ambitious in activating their huge diaspora. They have a ministry in the government for expats. They have special visa status for expats and their children. Even if you're born abroad, you can get a visa to go back and work in India for a time, because they think that's good. That, you know, if you're a Canadian, not expecting you to move to India, but maybe you want to go work in Mumbai for a term. India says, we'll make that easy or easier for you. Italy, there's 8 countries, I think it is. Italy is among them, that has parliamentary representation for its expats. I think that's probably a bridge too far for Canadians, but it's an interesting concept to say they're citizens. Let's give them representation in Parliament. Ireland and Scotland have both been very ambitious about getting people to come back, creating incentives to just come back for a visit, come back to invest in our country, because we need to keep those ties stronger rather than letting them kind of fade away. We're just passive about this in that Canadian way. We're nice about it, but you got to invest in the relationship, which is what all these countries are doing. And then lastly, Marina, I think you'd be totally in sync with this. We have to find ways to get younger Canadians out into the world. We're so good at getting the world to come here. We're not so good at getting our own people out into the world. Australia and New Zealand are both terrific at doing everything but almost packing the bags of a 20-year-old and saying, like, get out, just get out. We're going to give you financial incentives, all the incentives you need. Just get on a plane, get out of here, because you'll come back and we'll be stronger. We'll be more international. We'll be better networked because of that. One of the tragedies, smaller tragedies of the pandemic is there was some really good momentum among Canadian colleges and universities to incentivize and push students. Canadians are, you know, a lot of internationalists probably on this call. As a people, we're kind of homebodies. We actually don't like to move, even within the country. But there was this push in post-secondary to get students to leave the country, even for a study term. We got to get back at that when we can go abroad again.
I left the country myself a number of times during my undergraduate degrees, but now in my career, I've just actually moved across the province, and it was more difficult than getting up to Barcelona was. So definitely understand where that's coming from. One of the things you kind of touched on is this notion of wanting people to come back or worrying that they'll never come back. And there's a cool stat on page 228. In 2008, 422,000 Canadians paid Canadian taxes from abroad. And so that in the view here, it says the action showed a collective attachment by our expats to home. And that kind of ties into a question here that we've received via email as well. What can we do when people go, rather than feeling like we've lost them? What can we do to help them feel connected to Canada while they're away?
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, recognize that we have this population because so many people I spoke to feel forgotten. They're out there and they just feel kind of forgotten by their country. So identifying them or allowing them to volunteer themselves to be identified, to recognize this population, and to elevate them into the national conversation. I've recommended creating a unit as part of Rideau Hall under the Governor General to be responsible for expats. So this isn't a part of the administrative side of government. And let the Governor General speak for this population. David Johnston, the previous Governor General, who I talked to about this, was deeply committed to, or I shouldn't speak for him. He was committed to this idea. But rather than just be a symbolic relationship, we can create awards like the Order of Canada for expats. France does this, kind of a special designation. Bring the best. And not the celebrities necessarily, but bring 100 or 200 of the best back every couple of years to Rideau Hall for a couple of days to talk about what they're learning in the world. Think of how much smarter we'd be as a country if we could kind of hear from these Canadians doing incredible things to come back and say, what are you learning? What are we missing as a country? And, I hope they would want to be part of it. But if they don't, force the Prime Minister and ministers and premiers, as well as CEOs and NGO leaders, to sit in and just listen, and then create networks for feedback, so that, if your organization is trying to think through an issue, you'll know who are the best Canadian geographers or geographic thinkers in the world, and there are probably plenty who you can activate. So we need databases for that, voluntary, but they need to be constructed and managed. That takes money, which I think the government would be smart to invest in.
Now, you talked about kind of our niceness as Canadians as a superpower, and if empathy is one of our secret skills. This question's from Sarah Legault, who's our Director of Fundraising and Philanthropy. How do we ensure that secret skill is built into the next generation of our labor force?
It's something we think a lot about at RBC, because I oversee a group that has done a fair bit of research on skills needed for what's called the fourth industrial revolution. And we published what we think is a significant report in 2018 called Humans Wanted. If you're interested, you can just Google RBC and Humans Wanted, and you'll get a copy. And we did a year's worth of data analysis on the labor force, talked to employers and youth and educators across the country, and determined that the real skills in demand in the 2020s are going to be human skills, because the robots will do what robots can do, and we need to double down on what humans can do, what differentiates us from technology, but also have the skills to work with technology. And empathy is one of those skills. That is a power skill. It's not a soft skill. It's really hard to develop. And that's a power skill for the age of robots. We need to be more organized, but also ambitious in the way we declare that. There's no reason to be apologetic about being able to demonstrate your skills in empathy. You should have that on your resume. And we should be able to say to the world, not every Canadian by a long shot is empathetic. But odds are, when you hire a Canadian or work with a Canadian, you're getting someone who probably is empathetic. And I like to, and I hope people don't take this the wrong way, but I like to refer to Israelis when I talk about the special skills of Canadians. If you're ever hiring or deciding who to work with, and someone is recommended to you, an Israeli is recommended to you, and I have fantastic colleagues who are Israeli, so I say this out of deep respect, you probably have something in your mind when you hear that they're going to be, pretty determined. They're going to get things done. They're probably going to be maybe tough to work with, because that's a bit of the culture. But man, they're going to be reliable. They're going to get it done. Not all Israelis are like that, I know, but that's part of the country's reputation. How do we kind of similarly say to the world, look, we're not this kind of pushover milquetoast people. We get things done, but we get things done in a different way. So make sure, as you're building your team, that you're thinking, we could sure use a Canadian here for all the skills that we've talked about, including empathy. And it's not just one of these soft things. There's actually a recognition in your skill set. We're working with various skills groups in Canada on actually developing that as an identifiable skill, so that employers like us can see it. But wouldn't it be great if the rest of the world could also see it when they're hiring people out of Canadian universities or Canadians traveling around the world? They can see that on their profile.
So Gilles, our CEO and our publisher, he agrees the world needs more Canada. And he says he's heard this often in conversations, particularly around the future of energy. Do you agree that might be a specific industry? But what other industries could that apply to?
So, Jules, that's a great question. And yes, I've argued in different forums and written about the need for more Canadian energy, including oil and gas, which we produce better and more efficiently than most countries in the world. But the world also needs more Canadian energy skills. We have many of the best energy scientists and engineers on the planet. And you come across some of them in Planet Canada. There were some really interesting Canadian oil and gas engineers who I met in or came across virtually in Malaysia, but also they're in Nigeria, they're in Saudi Arabia. One of the largest nationalities on the payroll at Saudi Aramco is Canadians, because Saudi Aramco knows that when there's probably no country that is better at producing oil and gas engineers, I'd argue, than Canada. So they recognize that, they hire us. How do we use that as an advantage? Because no one knows that here in Canada. No one's saying, wow, we've got challenges in our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And by the way, there's all these Canadians working there. And it's not like they should suddenly be secret agents for our country, but they can be allies for us, and they want to be, and actually they are in many ways that I talk about in the book. So those skills that we're so good at producing here, we can export, but we also have to think of the IP to take advantage of that. So it's not just allowing Saudi Aramco to hire dozens of Canadians. I've got nothing against that, but wouldn't it be even better if there were Canadian companies that were actually selling that to Saudi Aramco and saying, okay, we're going to bring kind of the A team from Canada to do what you need to do. Or if you're building a hospital in the desert, and that's one of the cases I look at in the book, we're going to bring the A team of hospital builders, managers, and health professionals, because we know how to build and run hospitals in this country, and we'll do that for you in Dubai or in Saudi Arabia, and have that IP advantage as well as just the transfer of individuals.
Now that Canadianness, that kind of thing that makes us easily identifiable across the world, where do you think it comes from? Is it something that we need to nurture within our education system, or how do we develop this within ourselves?
The education system is the single greatest advantage that we as people have in this country, and it starts in kindergarten. The public education system in this country, as challenged as it is, as much as we all probably have our points of criticism, is still exceptional. I would argue there is no place on the planet that is better for education from K to PhD than Canada. And that's why students come here from around the world, including for high school. And I discovered that talking to young Canadians around the world. They said there's a young woman in the book, Yasmin Rafai, who's Iranian Canadian, who I met in London, England. She's now at Stanford at medical school. And she said, I am able to move from Canada to the UK, to Iran, to Stanford so seamlessly because of the public school I went to in Edmonton, Alberta. And she said the other advantage for me was the tobogganing hill in Edmonton. Because as kids, my parents would take us out to the tobogganing hill, and we just had to figure things out with other kids. There's another a Sudanese Canadian I profile in the book, who said one of the lessons he learned was from his father when they moved to Scarborough from Khartoum, and they learned to shovel their neighbor's sidewalk because their neighbors shoveled their sidewalk. And he said, boy, that's those Canadians. Isn't that interesting? They shovel each other's sidewalks. He said, that for me was a life lesson. He said, so now wherever I am in the world, and he's a computer engineer, has worked for Google around the world, now running his own company. He metaphorically, I'm always thinking about how to shovel someone else's sidewalk because I know they'll do the same for me. That's ingrained in us in our communities and in our education system. So we have to understand that kind of soft side of education. The classroom is not just all about the 3 R's. It's about that kind of secret 4th R of relationship, of learning how to deal with other people, which is kind of connected to all those other skills that we talked about.
Now, right now in the world, but also, of course, in Canada, which is surprising these days, we have all kinds of different cultural tensions that are happening right here at home. Some problems in Quebec, some ethnographic cultural tensions throughout the country, the highest rate of anti-Semitic incidents in recent history. And so Jason Muscat, another member of our team here at Can Geo, he wants to know if maybe we should be focused on taking care of Canada right here at home before we talk about Canadian values abroad.
Well, we need to do both. And I'm not sure we can do either without doing both. We are nowhere near perfect as a country or as a people. I hope I stress that enough in the book. And a lot of Canadians out there in the world are not good people. There's criminals, there's tax cheats, there's people on the lam, or people trying to escape their responsibilities here, or people who just want to get away from Canada. They don't like the country. So it's not like there's this homogenous group out there of altruists. But those challenges, Jason, that we need to continue to work on, and will probably be with us for a good while, and that includes our fundamental, foundational Indigenous challenge, are actually really important to the rest of the world, because how we work those out will be studied by the rest of the world. As flawed as the Indigenous relationships and foundational relationship is in this country, our determination to work that through and to make it better is being watched by the rest of the world. And how we do it actually is, to that point I stressed earlier on mutual accommodation, is so essential to the rest of the world. And so many Canadians I came across elsewhere were really honest about that with themselves and with the rest of the world. They're not walking around saying, "Hey, we're the perfect people." They know full well, because we do have myths and denial in this country, but we're also more open about our history than a lot of other countries that deny the darker parts of their history. And so Canadians out there are able to say, "Look, who are we to talk to you about Indigenous issues, or who are we to talk to you about human rights, or who are we to talk to you about hate speech," and on and on and on. But that's exactly the benefit, where we can say, we are not here to tell you that we've figured it out, but we can talk about how we try to figure it out, which can be of value to the rest of the world. And then the part we may be really missing is bringing those lessons back here and those insights back here. So as we struggle with reconciliation, for instance, or as we struggle with hate speech, as you articulated, what can we learn from Canadians elsewhere in the world who may be engaged in or working on or bring a perspective that we can benefit from? And that's where I would hope those sorts of networks and those gatherings and that kind of intelligence, kind of national intel approach would be really, really valuable, not just for us to be exporting, but to be re-importing that knowledge through Canadians.
I have a 2-layered question here for my last question, unless anything else comes in through the chat while you answer this one. But so how can we as Canadians, and then also as Canadian Geographic and the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, how can we better share the stories of what Canadians are doing out in the world?
Well, this is I hope a good start, but that is something I also discuss in some of the recommendations of the book, of building a platform, literally a platform, to help Canadians understand what Canadians are doing out there. This notion of a database isn't just like a telephone directory of find me a Canadian who's a good mineralogist or whatever in wherever. It's about profiling these people and what they're doing, especially for Canadian youth, because I would love out of all this for the next generation of Canadians to be able to see there are remarkable Canadians in every walk of life, in every corner of the world. And maybe that can be me. Maybe my ambition can be beyond this country. And that's not a betrayal to this country. Maybe I can be, aspire to be an architect in China, like Rafer Wallace, who I profile in the book, became 20 years ago coming out of Quebec. Or maybe I can be a human rights worker in Geneva or in Africa, like Joanna Liu from MSF is, who I profile in the book, and not lose a drop of being Canadian. I think that is so important for the next generation of Canadians. Rafer Wallace is such, I was so excited to meet him because he's so typical of the Canadians in the book, someone you've never heard of. He graduated from McGill in architecture, one of the top architects out of the school, kind of a footloose guy, wanted to go to the fastest growing place in the world, Shanghai. So he got on a plane and went to Shanghai, got hired, was given a suburb to build, even though he was not qualified, and figured out, stayed there, started his own business because he realized the buildings that were going up left, right, and center in Shanghai were sick. They were sick buildings. And so he created a whole business around green architecture that is now a software company that is almost like the Google of building products for China and increasingly for the world. And two maybe instructive points from that story. One is he created an office in Quebec to help run the company. So that I just find is so fascinating. Here's a guy who left Canada, stayed in Shanghai, raised his two kids who were born there, but came back to Canada as part of his global network. He doesn't need Canada. He wanted to, but he knew that great software engineers are here. So he was able to seize on that Canadian advantage. But the other point about Rafer that I love is he wants his kids to be Canadian. He brings them back every year. He teaches them how to snowboard. He wants them to be Canadian. And so we have to find ways to help him keep his kids Canadian, because what an asset for our country. And that includes, finding ways for them to come here for school, for post-secondary education, and the like.
And so what could companies like ours, the Royal Canadian Geographical Society or Canadian Geographic Magazine, what more can we do? Of course, having this talk with you is a great effort, but what else can we do?
Well, I think you may have a really good business opportunity just of expanding into that network of there's 2 to 3 million Canadians out there, many who, certainly the vast majority who I came across, who are more Canadian the longer they've been away than they were here. And they're constantly looking for information and connections with their home country. They devour CBC and Globe and Mail news as much as they can get it. And they need a broader range of information about their country. But they also need not just information about their country, they want connections to be able to help the country. So building platforms that allow them not just to read or to watch about Canada or about Canadians out in the world, but to actually sign up to be part of it. So I know Canadian Geographic thrives on explorers. So how to make those Canadian expats kind of the explorers of a digital and virtual age, and how can they help us all become better explorers in a digital and virtual age when sometimes we can't even walk out the door. That's not an excuse to stop exploring, and they're kind of they're experts at that, because that's how they got out into the world.
I know I promised that was the last question, but actually our assistant editor, Abby Hayward here, has dropped in the chat the perfect last question. So obviously musing on what it means to be Canadian and how to communicate that to the world is probably the most Canadian thing ever. But aside from that, in your life, what does it mean to you to be Canadian?
Oh, wow. You stumped the band with the last question.
It's a loaded question, but I think
No, it's a great one, and I don't want to be glib and just rattling off some cliches that it means to be nice, and I'm being sorry about being nice. I do come back to that point about shoveling your neighbor's sidewalk, which is a metaphor, although it also literally is important as we better brace ourselves for winter. But it's willing and wanting to just quietly do the little things that help your neighbor. And we need to continue to do that globally. We need to, as a country, but as a people, regardless of what the nation state is doing, find ways to metaphorically shovel our neighbor's sidewalk. And there's going to be a lot of stuff on our neighbor's sidewalks around the world in the coming decade because of COVID, most immediately, but because of technology and the darker sides of it, because of what's happening to the climate. And we are the people that don't say, you should shovel your sidewalk or leave a note on the door saying, I mean, I know some Canadians do that, but, and I don't want to go too far with the shovel metaphor here and depress everyone about winter. But we are the people who actually do that. And we need to remind ourselves, don't be the people that just put a sticky note on the neighbor's door saying, please do this. Actually help them do it. And that's what takes so many Canadians out into the world. They want to do that. They don't want to sit at home and just send messages around the world. So we need to continue to do that. We're an active people. We like to get out and do things. We like to be part of the world, and we need, I think, as people, to be part of the world. And then lastly, I think it is a respect, sticking with the snow metaphor, it's a respect for nature. We are constantly humbled by planet Earth as Canadians. We are reminded through the seasons of the power of nature and the power of geography. So while I say in the book we need to transcend geography, I think we also know we're always going to be humbled and shaped by geography as a people, and that makes us even more valuable because of that humility that comes from it. Winter has a way of humbling us, but the other seasons do in their own way, and that can be incredibly valuable in the 2020s for all those Canadians, and hopefully there'll be more and more who go out in the world, but even more so for the vast majority of us back here who just need to connect with them and need to invest in those networks so that this idea of Planet Canada becomes a real thing and a real contribution to the years ahead.
Speaking of Planet Canada, you can get your book at local bookstores, at Indigo, or on Amazon. It's also available as an ebook or an audiobook. And you can find links to purchase it at penguinrandomhouse.ca. But also, if you just Google Planet Canada or John Stackhouse, I'm sure it will come up in your feed. So spend the winter that's coming, that I personally am dreading, reading this excellent book. Yours doesn't come with Post-it notes or highlighted texts, but I'm sure that either John or myself will be happy to point you to some pages that you might enjoy. John, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It has been an absolute pleasure to listen to you speak.
No, the pleasure's mine. Thank you so much for including me in this this conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and thanks genuinely for all the work that everyone is doing to continue to build the country through our appreciation of all that is around us.
And I do want to encourage everyone to tune in on November the 5th for our next Can Geo virtual talk. That's with Margaret McMillan, who is conveniently an expat. She's joining us from the UK. So it'll be midnight her time, 7 p.m. Eastern our time. I'm hosting that talk as well, and it's my birthday that day. So everybody should come and tune in the same way you tuned in for this talk. November 5th, that's our next one. Thanks so much, everyone, for being with us here tonight. Have a great evening and a great long weekend. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Thank you. Stay well, stay safe. Happy Thanksgiving.